In the unforgiving wilderness of Alaska's Wrangell Mountains, where winter temperatures plummet to -60 degrees and daylight fades to mere hours, there existed a dark chapter of American history, buried beneath the snow for decades. This is the harrowing account of first cousins Jacob and Elellanena Caldwell, a couple whose bloodline had intertwined for generations. During the winter of 1938, their desperate fight for survival would lead them down a path of unimaginable depravity. Our story begins in the small, isolated settlement of Copper Valley, established in 1893 by a group of miners seeking fortune in Alaska's harsh interior. The original settlers included the Caldwell brothers, Thomas and William. Their descendants would eventually establish a pattern of familial unions, creating a closed genetic pool that spanned 4 generations. The Caldwells kept to themselves, recounts historian Dr. Margaret Thornton, who dedicated 15 years to researching this case. Local records show that by the 1930s, the family had intermarried to such a degree that nearly every member shared at least one grandparent. This isolation wasn't merely geographic, it was deliberately maintained. Born in 1908 to William Caldwell Jr. and his cousin wife Sarah, Jacob Caldwell exhibited the telltale physical traits of generations of consanguinity, unusually close-set eyes, a protruding brow, and a significantly reduced stature. A traveling doctor's journal from 1932 noted in its medical records that Jacob suffered from a peculiar form of mental slowness, though not entirely without cunning. His first cousin and eventual wife, Elellanena, born in 1912, displayed similar characteristics, a hunched posture, malformed fingers, and what local accounts described as episodes of uncontrollable rage. Their union in 1933, while it raised eyebrows even in the isolated community, was hardly unprecedented within the Caldwell lineage. What distinguished Jacob and Elellanena was their decision to establish their own homestead even further from civilization, in a remote valley accessible only by a treacherous mountain pass that became impassable during the winter months. They weren't running from judgment, explains anthropologist William Hayes. They were continuing a tradition of isolation that had defined their family for generations. The Caldwells believed outside blood would weaken them, that their resilience to Alaska's harsh conditions was the result of their purified bloodline. By 1937, Elellanena had given birth to 3 children, all of whom exhibited severe developmental abnormalities. The eldest, Thomas, age 4, could not speak and suffered frequent seizures. Mary, age 2, was born with a cleft palate so severe that feeding her required special techniques. The youngest, infant James, born in the spring of 1937, had a dramatically enlarged head and could not support it without assistance. These children represented the cumulative genetic burden of generations of consanguinity, explains geneticist Dr. Sarah Chun. When closely related individuals reproduce, recessive genetic disorders become dramatically more common. The Caldwell children were bearing the full weight of their parents' shared genetic material. The winter of 1937–38 arrived earlier than expected. By early October, the path to Copper Valley was already blocked by a heavy snowfall. Having spent much of the summer in bed with what Elellanena later described as one of his sickness periods, likely episodes of depression that historical accounts suggest were common among the inbred Caldwell line, Jacob had failed to properly prepare. Their food stores, insufficient even for a mild winter, began to dwindle by December. Game, normally scarce but available to experienced hunters, had migrated to lower elevations. As temperatures dropped to record lows, the family's situation grew desperate. What happened next was reconstructed years later through Elellanena journal, discovered in 1952 by a surveyor mapping potential routes for what would eventually become the Richardson Highway. The journal, written in a childlike scrawl on the backs of pages torn from an old Sears catalogue, documented the family's descent into the darkest form of survival. An entry dated January 16, 1938, reads, "The boy gone today. Jacob says it God's will. The little ones need meat. We keep all parts we can use. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel." The historical evidence that follows reveals the disturbing reality of genetic isolation that mainstream science doesn't want you to know about America's hidden past. This entry marks the beginning of what would become known among forensic historians as the Caldwell winter atrocity. Thomas, the eldest child, weakened by malnutrition and his genetic conditions, had died not from starvation, but according to later forensic analysis, from a deliberate act. The journal's clinical description of what followed indicates that Jacob and Elellanena processed their son's remains as they would have a hunted animal. This wasn't merely desperation, notes criminal historian Robert Jameson. The journal entries show a disturbing lack of emotional response. Elellanena writes about her son's remains with the detachment one might use to describe preserving musk meat. By February, with winter showing no signs of relenting, 2-year-old Mary also, as Elellanena journal puts it, went to God. The pattern repeated. The remains were processed and preserved in the sub-zero temperatures of a storage shed adjacent to their cabin. What makes this case particularly disturbing from a psychological perspective, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Ilan Morris, is the combination of the cognitive deficits likely resulting from generations of inbreeding, the extreme isolation, and the survival pressure of the Alaskan winter. The Caldwells appear to have rationalized their actions through a distorted religious framework, repeatedly referencing God's will and sacrifice in the journal. Most disturbing of all was the realization, pieced together by investigators in the 1950s, that infant James did not die of natural causes. An entry from March 9, 1938, reads simply, "The baby cries too much. Jacob says, it is time. Tomorrow we will have food again. God provides." The Caldwells survived until spring. When the snow began to melt in late April, Jacob ventured over the pass to Copper Valley for supplies. According to town records, he appeared thin but not starving and spoke little of the winter's hardships. He purchased supplies, ammunition, and, surprisingly, fabric for new children's clothes. He was already planning for replacements, Dr. Morris suggests grimly. The journal indicates Elellanena was pregnant again by June 1938. The truth about the Caldwell family's winter of 1938 might have remained buried forever if not for a chance discovery 14 years later. In the summer of 1952, the Alaskan Territory was undergoing rapid development following World War II. The U.S. Geological Survey dispatched teams throughout the region to map potential infrastructure routes to support military installations and the growing civilian population. Surveyor Michael Donovan and his assistant Peter Keene were charting the remote valleys of the Wrangell Mountains when they came across the abandoned Caldwell homestead. The main cabin had partially collapsed, but the storage shed remained largely intact, preserved by the region's dry, cold climate. "What we found inside that shed will haunt me until my dying day," Donovan wrote in his official report, portions of which remained classified until 1978. Small bones, clearly human, with precise cut marks consistent with butchering techniques. Some showed signs of having been boiled. In the corner, wrapped in oilcloth, we discovered the journal. The discovery prompted a discreet investigation by federal authorities, who were concerned about public reaction in the midst of Alaska's push for statehood. The investigation revealed that Jacob Caldwell had died in 1949 from what appeared to be complications of a genetic liver disorder common in consanguineous families. Elellanena had returned to the small Caldwell enclave in Copper Valley with 3 new children, all exhibiting similar developmental issues to her first 3. Elellanena never spoke of the winter of 1938, reports Janice Miller, whose grandmother lived in Copper Valley. But local rumors persisted. People noted that she referred to her second set of children by the same names, Thomas, Mary, and James, as if she were replacing the one she had lost. When federal investigators finally interviewed Elellanena in 1952, they found a woman whose grip on reality had severely deteriorated. At just 40 years old, she appeared decades older, with advanced arthritis deforming her already malformed hands further and cataract clouding her eyes, another common consequence of recessive genetic disorders compounded by inbreeding. She spoke of the children as if they were all alive, the lead investigator noted in his report. When pressed about the winter of 1938, she would only say, "We did what was necessary." The family continues. The blood stays pure. Genetic analysis, though primitive by today's standards, conducted on hair samples from Elellanena and her living children confirmed what the investigators suspected. The degree of genetic homozygosity, identical genes inherited from both parents, was among the highest ever recorded in humans at that time, comparable only to certain royal families of Europe where consanguinity had been practiced for generations. The Caldwell lineage represents a unique case study in human genetic isolation, explains Dr. Chun. Their bloodline had become so concentrated that by Elellanina's generation, the genetic diversity was comparable to what you might find between third-generation siblings. Even though she and Jacob were technically first cousins, their parents and grandparents had already drastically reduced the genetic variation. The consequences of this genetic narrowing weren't limited to physical abnormalities. Cognitive development, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning were all affected, notes Dr. Morris. Medical records from a missionary doctor who visited Copper Valley in the 1940s noted that many Caldwell children exhibited stunted moral development and a peculiar absence of empathy, particularly towards suffering. This observation provides crucial context for understanding how Jacob and Elellanena could commit such unthinkable acts against their own children. In a very real sense, they were prisoners of their own biology, suggests neuropsychologist Dr. Henry Wilson. Generations of inbreeding had altered brain development in ways that affected their capacity for empathy and moral judgment. Combined with physical isolation and survival stress, it created perfect conditions for this tragedy. The Caldwell case presents a grim example of what anthropologists call genetic drift in isolated populations. When a small founding group reproduces primarily within itself, genetic diversity decreases with each generation, and harmful recessive traits become increasingly common. What happened with the Caldwells was an extreme version of processes we've seen in other isolated communities, explains anthropologist Dr. Hayes. From the Harpsbocks of Europe to certain isolated religious communities, consanguinity over multiple generations creates a compounding effect of genetic disorders. By 1953, with the investigation concluded but kept from public knowledge, authorities faced a difficult decision about Elellanena and her surviving children. Concerns about their welfare competed with the era's tendency to hide family situations deemed disturbing or shameful. The Caldwell case exemplifies what sociologists now recognize as a pattern in isolated communities: the development of alternative moral frameworks that rationalize and normalize consanguinity. Elellenena's journal repeatedly references "keeping the blood strong" and "the purity of the line," phrases that anthropologists have documented in other genetically isolated groups. These communities often develop what we call counter-narratives to justify practices that broader society condemns, explains sociologist Dr. Rebecca Lawrence. They invert the understanding of genetic health, viewing outside genes as contamination rather than necessary diversity. Government records declassified in the 1980s revealed that officials ultimately decided to place Elellanena in a psychiatric institution in Anchorage, where she remained until her death in 1965. Her 3 surviving children were placed in a specialized care facility, their existence kept largely secret from the public. Medical files from this facility, made available to researchers in 2005 under strict confidentiality agreements, paint a grim picture of the children's development. All 3 suffered from multiple genetic disorders, including progressive neurological conditions that led to their premature deaths. The last surviving child, the second James Caldwell, died in 1979 at age 38. Ending the direct line of this branch of the Caldwell family. The genetic legacy of the Caldwells represents a stark warning about the biological consequences of inbreeding, says geneticist Dr. Chun. Studies of their preserved DNA samples show a level of genetic homozygosity that would be nearly impossible in a non-consanguineous population. In essence, their genome had become a concentrated repository of recessive disorders. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made during Elellenena's psychiatric evaluation. When shown photographs of children who were not her own, she identified them as not pure and weak blood. When asked directly about the winter of 1938, she responded with a statement that chilled investigators: "We kept the strongest parts inside us. Nothing wasted. The family continues through what we preserved." If you've been shocked by the Caldwell's disturbing survival methods, type "blood must remain pure" in the comments section below. It will help us understand who truly appreciates these hidden historical accounts that mainstream media refuses to cover. This statement suggests that in Elellenena's distorted worldview, consuming her children was not merely an act of desperate survival, it represented a perverse continuation of the family bloodline, a way of preserving their genetic material when the children themselves could not survive. The Caldwells had created their own closed universe with its own logic, notes anthropologist James Harrison, who studied similar cases of extreme isolation in remote communities. Within that logic, their actions made sense to them. This is the danger of complete isolation combined with generations of inbreeding. Reality itself becomes warped. By the 1950s, most of the original Caldwell enclave in Copper Valley had dispersed or died out. Those few who remained gradually integrated into wider communities as Alaska moved toward statehood. Blood samples collected from distant Caldwell relatives in the 1970s showed that as the family finally began outbreeding, the concentration of genetic disorders diminished within just 2 generations. This demonstrates both the damage consanguinity can cause and the remarkable resilience of human genetics, Dr. Chun explains. When diversity is restored, within just 2 generations of outbreeding, the most severe disorders that had plagued the Caldwells for decades began to disappear from the family line. The cabin where the Caldwells' darkest acts took place was deliberately burned by federal authorities in 1953, an attempt to erase this disturbing chapter of Alaskan history. The location was marked on maps simply as abandoned settlement until 1978, when historical preservation requirements led to its proper documentation. Today, the site is unmarked and largely forgotten, accessible only by a strenuous hike through wilderness that remains nearly as remote as it was in the 1930s. There's still a sense of shame associated with the Caldwell case, notes Alaskan historian Thomas Mackenzie. Not just because of what Jacob and Elellanena did, but because the community allowed this level of inbreeding to continue for generations. There were opportunities for intervention that never came. The psychological aftermath extended beyond the immediate family. When news of the investigations finally leaked to the Copper Valley community in the late 1950s, several Caldwell relatives committed suicide. Others changed their names and moved to distant parts of Alaska or the continental United States, seeking to escape the shadow of their family history. The Caldwell case illustrates how consanguinity creates not just a genetic burden but a psychological one that can echo across generations, explains Dr. Morris. Even relatives who had married outside the family felt marked by the Caldwell name after the truth emerged. The scientific significance of the Caldwell case extends beyond its shock value. Medical researchers in the 1960s, gaining access to tissue samples and medical records from Elellanena and her children, identified several previously undocumented genetic disorders that have since been recognized in other populations. The Caldwell genome became a crucial reference point in early genetic research, explains medical historian Dr. Julia Patterson. Their extreme inbreeding had essentially created a natural laboratory for studying recessive genetic disorders. Several conditions first documented in the Caldwell children are now known by different names in medical literature. One such condition, originally documented as Caldwell syndrome, is now recognized as a rare form of progressive neurological disorder affecting fewer than 1 in 50,000 people worldwide. The syndrome causes gradual deterioration of cognitive function, particularly affecting moral reasoning and emotional regulation, potentially contributing to Jacob and Elellanenna's capacity to commit their acts. What makes the Caldwell case so valuable from a scientific perspective is the detailed documentation across multiple generations, explains genetic researcher Dr. Matthew Williams. The family records, combined with medical observations from the 1930s through the 1970s, allowed researchers to track how specific genetic disorders emerged and compounded over time. The case ultimately became a cornerstone in arguments against consanguineous marriage. When Alaska achieved statehood in 1959, it enacted some of the strictest laws in the nation against marriage between close relatives, directly influenced by legislators' knowledge of the Caldwell case. The legislation never mentioned the Caldwells by name, notes legal historian Patricia Coleman, but archival records from the Constitutional Convention show that several delegates had been briefed on the case. It clearly influenced their thinking on family law. Beyond the scientific and legal implications, the Caldwell case offers a window into how isolated communities can develop their own moral frameworks that diverge dramatically from wider society. Anthropologists have documented similar phenomena in remote religious communities, where isolation combined with consanguinity often leads to increasingly extreme belief systems that justify the practice. The Caldwell's journals reveal a worldview where conventional morality had been completely inverted, explains cultural anthropologist Dr. Lisa Chen. They viewed genetic diversity as contamination and the sacrifice of their children as a continuation of their bloodline. This inversion of values is a documented pattern in extremely isolated, inbred communities. Perhaps most disturbing are the indications that the Caldwells were not unique in Alaska's remote regions. Government surveys conducted in the 1960s, part of a classified study on isolated populations, identified at least 3 other settlements in Alaska's interior where consanguinity rates exceeded 40%, meaning nearly half of all marriages were between blood relatives. The Alaskan frontier attracted a certain type of individual, explains historian Dr. Thornton. People who sought extreme isolation, who rejected the norms and oversight of society. In such conditions, with small founding populations and minimal outside contact, consanguinity became not just common but institutionalized. These other communities, though never experiencing tragedies as extreme as the Caldwells, exhibited many of the same patterns: elevated rates of birth defects, cognitive disabilities, and the development of belief systems that rationalize inbreeding as beneficial rather than harmful, Dr. Hayes suggests. The Caldwells represent the extreme end of a spectrum, but the underlying dynamics, isolation, limited mate selection, and the gradual normalization of consanguinity were present in multiple frontier communities. By the 1960s, improved transportation and communication began to break down many of these isolated pockets. The construction of the Alaska Highway and the expansion of air service meant that even remote communities were no longer completely cut off from the outside world. Integration happened gradually, notes Alaskan sociologist Dr. James Peterson. As children from these isolated communities gained access to education and exposure to the wider world, many chose not to return. The most extreme practices of consanguinity began to die out naturally as younger generations rejected them. The Caldwell case also raises difficult questions about society's responsibility to intervene in isolated communities. Records show that a territorial health officer who visited Copper Valley in 1931 noted the concerning degree of intermarriage among the Caldwells but took no action, viewing it as a private family matter in keeping with the hands-off approach to frontier settlements at the time. By modern standards, there were numerous missed opportunities for intervention, notes medical ethicist Dr. Robert Sherman. But we must be careful about applying contemporary values to historical situations. The concept of state intervention in family matters was far more limited in the 1930s, particularly in frontier territories. The legacy of the Caldwell case continues to influence multiple fields of study today. In genetics, researchers still reference what they call the Caldwell effect, the exponential increase in genetic disorders when consanguinity occurs across multiple generations. What made the Caldwells unique was not just that Jacob and Elellanena were first cousins, explains geneticist Dr. Sarah Chun. It was that their parents were cousins, their grandparents were cousins, and this pattern extended back at least 4 generations. Each generation of inbreeding doesn't just add to the genetic burden, it multiplies it. Modern genetic analysis techniques applied to preserved Caldwell DNA samples in 2010 revealed that Jacob and Elellanena shared approximately 25% of their genetic material, equivalent to half-siblings despite being officially first cousins. This extreme genetic similarity explains the severity of disorders in their children. In a typical first-cousin marriage, the genetic risk increases but remains relatively manageable, Dr. Chun explains. What we see in the Caldwells is the compounding effect over generations. By the time we reach Jacob and Elellanenna's children, the genetic homozygosity was catastrophically high. The psychological aspects of the case have proven equally valuable to researchers. The detailed documentation of Elellenena's thought processes through her journal provides rare insight into how extreme isolation and genetic factors can reshape moral reasoning. Elellenena's journal is studied in forensic psychology as a unique case of environmentally and genetically influenced moral distortion, explains Dr. Morris. Her writing shows no recognition that her actions were wrong. In her isolated reality, consuming her children was rationalized as preservation of the family line. This perspective offers crucial context for understanding how seemingly unthinkable acts can occur in isolated environments. The Caldwells were not simply desperate survivors who broke societal taboos, they had developed an entirely different moral framework where conventional ethics had no meaning. We see this pattern repeated in other isolated groups throughout history, notes sociologist Dr. Lawrence. From remote religious cults to isolated geographical enclaves, extreme isolation combined with intermarriage often leads to moral systems that can justify acts the broader society considers abhorrent. The archaeological aspects of the case have also yielded important information. When a team of forensic anthropologists was finally permitted to excavate the Caldwell homestead site in 1998, they discovered additional remains that confirmed details from Elellenena's journal and provided new insights. The archaeological evidence suggests this wasn't a one-time occurrence, explains forensic anthropologist Dr. Michael Richards. Analysis of bone fragments found around the property indicates that similar consumption practices may have occurred in previous generations of Caldwells during particularly harsh winters. This finding suggests that what Jacob and Elellanena did, while extreme, may have been drawing on family precedent, a traditional survival strategy passed down through generations of isolated Caldwells, rather than a spontaneous decision made under duress. The broader implications for understanding human behavior in isolation continue to make the Caldwell case relevant. As space agencies prepare for potential long-duration missions to Mars, psychologists have studied the Caldwell case and similar examples of isolated group dynamics to understand how moral reasoning can shift in small, isolated communities over time. The Caldwell case represents an extreme example of what can happen when humans are completely cut off from the moderating influence of broader society, explains Dr. Wilson. While space missions would involve carefully selected, psychologically screened individuals, the fundamental human vulnerability to moral drift in isolation remains a concern. In Alaska itself, the Caldwell story has become a kind of dark folklore, rarely discussed openly but present in the collective memory of long-term residents. The precise location of the homestead is no longer marked on public maps, a deliberate decision by state authorities to prevent macabre tourism. The few remaining Caldwell descendants, now several generations removed from the consanguineous past, have largely changed their names and integrated into mainstream society. DNA testing has confirmed that with the introduction of genetic diversity, the severe disorders that plagued the family have largely disappeared. The Caldwell story ultimately has a hopeful aspect, concludes geneticist Dr. Williams. It demonstrates both the terrible consequences of genetic isolation and the remarkable healing power of genetic diversity. Within just 3 generations of outbreeding, most of the disorders that defined the family for decades have been diluted to the point of disappearance. As Alaska has transformed from a remote frontier to a modern state, the conditions that allowed the Caldwell tragedy to occur have largely vanished. Improved transportation, communication, and social services mean that even the most remote communities are no longer truly isolated in the way the Caldwells were. Yet the case remains a powerful reminder of human vulnerability to isolation and how quickly the moorings of conventional morality can shift when people are cut off from the wider world. In an age of increasing polarization and digital bubbles, the Caldwell case offers a stark warning about the dangers of isolation, whether physical or ideological. The most disturbing aspect of the Caldwell case is not what they did, reflects Dr. Morris. It's how their isolation made it seem logical and necessary within their distorted worldview. Any group that cuts itself off completely from outside perspectives risks a similar kind of moral drift, even if the consequences aren't as extreme. In the final analysis, the story of Jacob and Elellanena Caldwell stands as a dark chapter in American frontier history, a reminder of the thin veneer of civilization and how quickly it can erode under the pressures of isolation, genetic deterioration, and survival necessity. If you watched this far, you clearly appreciate the depth of these hidden historical accounts. Leave a comment saying, "I watched it all, so I can get to know who truly values these stories on this channel." Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next investigation into America's darkest family secrets. Hit the like button if you found this story educational, and share it with anyone who appreciates uncovering the buried truths of our past. The bones of the Caldwell children, recovered during the 1998 excavation, were finally given a proper burial in an unmarked grave in Anchorage, a quiet acknowledgement of a tragedy born from isolation, consanguinity, and the unforgiving wilderness of America's last frontier.